Thanks, Eric. So I'll talk a little about this new book project, but I'm over at 4S in Copenhagen right now, and that's why I talked about all morning, so I'll shift the discussion to something more interesting, maybe. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, which is nice to have the time, because this morning I had to talk for 7 minutes, compressing 30 minutes into 7 minutes. So I'm going to talk about three things. First, this idea of research creation, which is a Canadian invention. It goes by various names in Europe: practice-based research, artistic research, but the Canadian model is slightly different. Susan knows something about it since she was there for a while in Canada. Then I'm going to talk about Hexagram as the site for that kind of practice to take place. And then the fun stuff, so I'll go through Hexagram. It's kind of infrastructure and the types of research labs it involves and what we do. And then I'll talk about two projects as case studies, which will go in two different directions, but actually I think are quite exemplary for thinking about how do we combine research and artistic or design work with the social science, humanities, and the engineering and the natural sciences. And those two projects are a project called Polytope. Well, actually, the order is Displace, which deals with the anthropology of the senses, and Polytope, which is a reimagining of work from the Greek-French composer Ioannis Xenakis in the 1960s called Polytopes. Okay, so let's talk about research creation. So, as I said, there's a lot of discussion, as we know, in Europe about how do we understand art making or design making within the traditional structure of academic frameworks. And of course, in the German-speaking world, I'm also based in Germany, in Berlin, so I know something about it. It's very different than North America because you have a very strong separation between the university, even though because of the Bologna process, universities, art schools have become universities, but only in name, really. Between the traditional university, which is dedicated to Wissenschaft, science, and the art and design academies, which were dedicated to practice. So those were up to recently quite separate, and actually ideologically still are in a lot of ways. In North America, you don't have that because you have art schools embedded within universities. You have the liberal arts context, which is a different model. I don't know as much about Scandinavia, so we can talk about that later. The idea in Canada is this idea of how can you take creative practice, and that does not just include technology. It actually includes any creative practice: architecture, design, theater, dance, literature, poetry, translation. How can you contextualize that and understand it under the methods or frameworks that have been firmly established in the humanities and the social sciences, i.e. theoretical frameworks, method, all of these rubrics of understanding and knowledge creation that come from those traditional, mainly text-based approaches. The Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada in 2001 issued a policy report on the future of the humanities. And very interestingly, what they said was, we have to bridge the gap between the creative and interpretive disciplines and link the humanities more closely with arts communities. What that meant, and in fact it's actually come to bear in the last year, is that the humanities should link up with the arts not only because the interest in practice is important and another alternative to just textual-based accounts, that the humanities and social sciences deal with, but also, and this is obviously something that in Sweden is probably we were talking about Carolina earlier about this, also because you bring in a whole different set of so-called stakeholders or constituents, different audiences, right? So of course, if you produce artistic work, you reach a very different audience than you would if you go to an academic conference like 4S in Copenhagen. So there was an interest in SSHRC in trying to reach different audiences. There were three very specific reasons why Canada decided to fund, and Quebec was the first, in fact, before the federal system undertook the interest in research and creation. There were three reasons. One was that artists, researchers who were working within university contexts, one had to contribute to the development of their fields like any other scholarly discipline. The second was the issue of training. Not only do you have to create new knowledge, but you also have to train the next generation to create new knowledge, right? And the third was, how do you develop creative work within a research infrastructure while understanding that actually artistic or design or practices are very different than, for instance, sitting in a library or, well, libraries don't really, people don't sit in libraries anymore, sitting in front of your computer and writing something. So three reasons why there was an interest in supporting this kind of work. This is a lot of stuff, and I'm just going to go through it quickly. Practice is a long discussion, right? And actually, anthropology and sociology for the last 60 years have been dealing with this question about what is practice. It means on the ground. It means not a bird's eye view as a distanced observer, but it actually means what do you do if you get mixed up in the actual act of making. And so practice is contextualized within different regimes, historical, theoretical, or conceptual. Rigor is another question that comes up. You know, how do you evaluate? This is probably a big question. How do you evaluate artistic work? Isn't that subjective? Whereas, you know, statistics, like sociologists, is somehow objective. Of course, these discussions have been torn apart also for 30 years, and people like in social studies of science and technology. But how do you understand rigor? Where you're creating, because rigor is understood as contributing original knowledge to a field. The third idea is that, like, if you support research and creation, you can't just kind of come up with some kind of theoretical ideas. You actually have to produce concrete things, right? Whether those are tools or texts or performances or products or something that actually reaches out into the world. As I said, part of that also involves reaching other kinds of audiences or so-called stakeholders. The other thing is that you know, research creation should be peer reviewed, right? So this is, of course, this guarantees quality, right? Blind peer review or just peer review, meaning that it's evaluated according to your peers, right? So if you decide to create a work, whether that's, you know, a design object or a dance performance, that should be evaluated in terms of its quality, in terms of its rigor, by peers, like any other academic discipline. So it's very interesting. Like, you can just see this language is not a language that comes from the way in which creative people really think. Creative people in the sense of artists or designers that work outside of research academic structures, because the idea of trying to specify and say what your methods are and how you're contributing something original to an already existing body of knowledge just doesn't really happen. I mean, there's still the myth of originality that happens in the art world, for instance. You know, that I'm you know, a genius and I'm making something completely from my own experience in the world. Well, of course, everyone knows that's not true. You're, of course, always responding to the themes of your time, what people have done before you, but you don't need to write it down. You know, you don't need to justify it. Whereas once you work within a research infrastructure, in a research context, you very much have to justify it, because how can you just be operating in a vacuum? You know? So these are some of the questions that come about, the thorny area of trying to understand how it is that artistic or let's say praxis functions within these traditional rubrics in the humanities or the social sciences, or even, of course, the sciences. Okay, so there's beautiful Montreal. It's a very funny slide. Hexagram was founded in 2001 between two universities. This is also was part of the Quebec government's interest in linking the French and the English-speaking worlds together. And two of those universities had the largest university-based art schools in Canada: Concordia, which has a faculty of a student body of 3,000 in the fine arts alone, and 150 faculty members, and the University of Quebec at Montreal, UQAM. In 2001, $30 million came from the Quebec provincial government, along with the majority of it came from the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, which funds large-scale scientific infrastructure in research complexes, in universities and independent research centers, as well as government research centers. And it was for a project called Converging Digital Content, Interdisciplinary Research in Emerging Cinema and Interactive Media Arts. And the goal of that was to attract highly qualified artists, researchers, and students in a variety of fields dealing with digital content production. And that was a quite wide range. So interactive media, computer-based arts, environmentally sound product design, interactive textiles, wearable computing, digital gaming, and attract those students and faculty from around the world. and at the same time to encourage collaboration between, this is all very common language, of course, between researchers, graduate students, industry, cultural organizations, and other stakeholders in Quebec, in Canada, and internationally. So what did they do? Well, in this building that was built in 2006, that's when I actually went to Canada, to Concordia. This is downtown Montreal. And then on the right, you have Côte de Sciences at UQAM. Concordia actually took some of this infrastructure money and built 3 floors additionally onto this new computer science and fine arts building. So that infrastructure money supported actual capital in the building process itself, and basically built 2 floors of laboratories, equipment depots, black box for research, and so on. So here's some pictures. So there's audio, video editing hubs. These are actually old pictures. There's a whole slew of new equipment that came in. So editing suites. It's interactive textile labs that there are researchers in the fine arts who are doing a lot of work in weaving technologies and in conductive materials. So for instance, I just touched the computer and have lost the slide. These are computer-controlled or computer-augmented looms. This is an old recording studio. There's a new one now. Rapid prototyping, of course, 3D scanning, different types of modeling processes, laser scanning, and so on. CNC fabrication for metal, robotics, digital imaging, high-end digital printers, all this tools, the TAG, which is a digital gaming lab, and then this very large-scale black box research space, which is available to researchers in a block of time of 15 days, 24/7, in which larger-scale projects are built. Some work there. So now you'll see the scale. About 80 faculty members between Concordia, UQAM, University of Montreal, McGill, and now the École de Technologie Supérieure, ETS, are involved in Hexagram. So Hexagram, Concordia has its own physical site, which is bigger than UQAM's, and UQAM has its own. Concordia has already 56 members, so it stretches across 3 faculties. It stretches between the faculties of arts and science, the faculty of the fine arts, and the faculty of engineering and computer science. Funny enough, no one in the business school yet. Arts and science, of course, includes the natural sciences. And in even the fine arts, you have studio arts, you have performing arts, you have design, you have film, communication studies, art history, sociology, etc. It also involves the École de Design Industriel in University of Montreal. It also involves UQAM. And there's 10 part-time, full-time technicians, as well as an administrative coordinator. So it's very large. 400 since 2006, 400 graduate students have used the infrastructure and also work as collaborating research assistants, apprentices, and students. And this is strategic to Quebec, which is this idea of training so-called highly qualified personnel, people who would kind of think out of the box and be able to go out into the media industries of Quebec. And media industry doesn't just mean commercial industries. It also means cultural industries, which are state-supported. So it's not just technical training. It's actually thinking different ways about the way media works and how it moves from in different forms and practices. So the strategic research axes, these are old. New ones have entered into the picture, but were mainly organized around genres and less about kind of research topics. So you had responsive textiles and wearable computing, sustainable design, interactive game design away from the kind of first-person shooter models, technologies and content, interestingly enough, not just technology, but actually content, which is, of course, the weird separation for interactive performance, interactive responsive environments, and virtual heritage, and content for HD cinema. So you can see these are certain genres. Because of those genres, different labs, equipment structures were established, infrastructure was established to support researchers working in those territories. So it's not just media as one envelope, it's actually a whole range of practices that Hexagram wanted to support. And a lot of these come, again, from individual faculties' interests, as well as graduate students' interests. and how to support those interests under this larger thing called Hexagram. What Caroline and I also were talking about this earlier. What's essential is this kind of ecology that happens in Montreal. Montreal is only it's a city of 3.5 million people, so but it has, of course, the energy of a city like Berlin in terms of its cultural scene, and so clearly part of the strategy is to create these partnerships between Hexagram and a range of partners that are operating both in museums and festivals, industry, in commercial industry. So here's a list. So Electra and Mutec are big media festivals. The SAT is the Société Arts et Technologiques, which is an independent art and technology research center, although it's connected to UDM because Luc Cochen, who's a professor at UDM, is also the co-artistic director of the SAT. There's Obro, there's the Goethe Institute, there's the Phi Center, which is a new center, which is private money. The Daniel Langlois Foundation it doesn't exist anymore, but it was a partner. The Canadian Center for Architecture, Cirque du Soleil Moment Factory, which is a big media company that we're actually working with right now. Ubisoft, the Festival du Monde Cinéma, goes on and on and on. So you have constituents from universities, you have cultural players, and you have commercial players. And it's not this rosy picture that everyone goes between all of these sectors, but there are some people like myself and some others that actually gravitate and move through this different ecology. So it's not like these things are separate from each other. They're actually sometimes interdependent and sometimes codependent on each other, and sometimes just they want to acknowledge the other sectors are there. You know, that, for instance, the commercial media industries are looking at what the artists, researchers, and the universities are doing, and there's actually funding programs established, which I'll talk about in a second, that try to make those connections more tangible through actually funding. Now, that's the kind of broader picture of Hexagram. Now, what Hexagram is, as I said, is a kind of large umbrella. Okay, it's infrastructure, right? So it's technical infrastructure, it's space, it's the physical plant, and under that, at Concordia, for instance, there are around 18 small independent research creation labs that are run by faculty in Hexagram that lie under that umbrella. These labs, it's a kind of parasitic relationship. These labs utilize the Hexagram structure, but they're not funded by Hexagram. They're funded by individual faculty applying for funding from the various research councils in Quebec as well as Canada. So again, the interesting thing about Quebec is everything is doubled. So Canada has its own research council for the social sciences and humanities, the so-called SHRC. It has its own arts council, the Canadian Council for the Arts. It has its own engineering and research council, NSERC, and so on, its own health council. Quebec has Quebec versions of all of those that are independent of those federal bodies. They share information, but they're independent of each other. And so as a researcher in Quebec, you actually have double pots of money you're applying for all the time, which means there's more work you have to do. And more grants to write, but there's more money in that sense. There's more funding opportunities. So these individual research labs are driven exclusively by the faculty members that run them. So the way a lab emerges is somebody comes in and gets money and gets space and establishes a kind of lab, and gets students, and it kind of works that way. And those researchers seem to be successful. They get more money. They get more students. It's kind of like the MIT Media Lab model, where if you just start at the Media Lab, you have a desk and maybe one student. And if the more funding you get, the more sponsors you get, then the students increase in the desk space. The real estate increases. But what you have is Hexagram to support all of projects that would actually be quite impossible to do without that infrastructure. So for instance, people applying for federal funding or provincial funding say, I'm able to do this project because I have access to these kinds of, red HD cameras, and I have, access to a full 96 channel surround studio. And so what Hexagram does is enable, because it's a research infrastructure, it enables different kinds of practices to actually take place. And that's quite interesting as a model, you know. And so it's odd because a lot, as I know, as you also know as well, particularly in Germany, for instance, a lot of money was pushed in the 1990s into building infrastructure, and then people were like, we have to find content for this infrastructure. The hexagram model kind of worked a similar way, but you then had people who had their own agendas who then came in and said, okay, well, this infrastructure will make the kind of research I do possible, and how do we build that up? This is kind of blurry. If you go on hexagram.concordia.ca, you can find all this. So here's just a range of some of the researchers, the kind of work they do. So Bill Vorn, for instance, runs this A-Lab. Bill Vorn is a well-known artist in the kind of new media and robotics scene. Flux Media is a project that's not in the Faculty of Fine Arts, but in Arts and Science, run by Tanguy Duff, a colleague of mine who's working in art and biology. Matrolab is Sandeep Bhagwati, who's a composer who's interested in kind of Gesamtkunstwerk and the idea building new kinds of music, improvisational music systems. Mobile media, Subtella is directed by Barbara Lane, who's working on these weaving technologies and so on. So you can see that each of these labs has its own structure, its own space, etc. Hexagram is not a teaching institution. That's a very important thing in terms of, it has no curriculum. It's an independent research lab, probably like Medea. It doesn't, people come together under Hexagram, but it doesn't have a teaching mandate. In fact, it's not allowed under the CFI funding rules. Here's just some pictures of some projects. So this is Joanna Brzezowska, who's very well known actually in Scandinavia for doing a lot of work with computational fabric. This is Bill Vorn's work. This is Sandeep Bhagwati. This is me, and so on. So here's a bit of the infrastructure stuff, and then I'll get to my own stuff in the last 20 minutes. So we have these independent studio labs that operate under the umbrella, and then we have Hexagram R&D. Now, Hexagram, when it was founded, was very much interested in the notion of transfer, right? And that's why it was funded. It actually was funded originally by the Ministry of Economic Development in Quebec. And the idea was to train people, you know, to transfer knowledge, experience into these different industries. That was problematic. In 2008 or 2009, the MDIEE, the Economic Development Ministry, ended the funding of Hexagram, and the universities took it over. And what the MDIE said is, we want to fund exclusively industry partnerships. The universities were smart enough to realize that the infrastructure was large enough and starting to attract international members that they decided to fund them exclusively through university funding. And now this is shifting again because there's other funding pots opening up to fund it. But what the economic development money did was create what's called CINQ, the Consortium Innovation Numérique du Québec, and that's supporting direct industry research partnerships. So, you know, this is exclusively economic. This is designed to maintain Quebec's competitive advantage internationally. You know, Quebec actually has industries that are all over Europe, like Bombardier is from Quebec, which builds all the European trains. Cirque du Soleil is one of the largest entertainment companies in the world. So Quebec construction companies like SNC-Lavalin built half of Dubai. So it's very strange for such a small province that it has such economic power. The funding structure for these kind of research, industry research projects was in 2010, this has changed. 30% comes from industry, 40% directly from the government, and the other 30% was made up from industries, universities or public sources. That's changed. Now it's 70% government and 30% industry. And I'll talk about a project, the Polytope project is connected to that in some ways. The third part of the framework for Hexagram is what's called Hexagram Research Creation. And actually that's the center I'm running. As I've shown you, there's a lot of infrastructure. What we decided in 2010 was to split the infrastructure away from the research center to actually enable what was the original purpose of Hexagram, which was to create partnerships with faculty and students and other stakeholders outside the university for actual research and not just equipment. So that center just started, and in fact, became director of it as of 6 months ago, and then I went on sabbatical, so I don't have to deal with any of it until January. But our aim now is to try to support interfaculty initiatives under the Hexagram research creation umbrella, and to build this research center. And the last is Hexagram CM. This is Quebec. It's very complicated. They construct all these structures to do things, but it's also, what the structure does. So once you understand the kind of Byzantine thinking behind things, you understand, okay, that's where I go for that kind of project and that kind of money, and that's where I go for that kind of thing. And, there's Hexagram CM. And because, as I said, Hexagram was not allowed to develop curriculum or to fund students because it was infrastructure money, what they did was create this other thing called CM. And that links UQAM and these other universities together. It's what we call a pole for research creation, which is a kind of center. And its objective is so-called internationalization, is to do big international projects. Okay, so that's a little about Hexagram. And you can see, well, a lot about Hexagram. And you can see that there's a lot of toys and a lot of tools. But the question is, what are people actually doing with those things? So now I'm going to switch my hat and talk as the director of one of these laboratories, and talk specific about these two artistic projects and that move between different disciplines. One deals with anthropology of the senses, and the other deals with artificial intelligence. So Lab Xmodal, which, if anyone's doing work in perception, is cross-modal. Cross-modal, of course, means the idea of the way in which different sensory modalities connect. This is the lab that I founded. I call it a studio lab, under the way that Michael Century talks about the studio lab as a kind of, it's not a scientific laboratory. It's not also an atelier. It's somehow a hybrid in between those things. And we do three things. We make art and design types of projects, and design is a very broad sense. I'm not talking about just like products actually, but design is a kind of way of building systems. We're interested in techniques or technologies, and they're also interested in trying to cultural frames around those things. And the main research question I have, coming from the backgrounds I come from, performance, i.e. from theater and the performing arts, but also looking at performance in other disciplines, is how do we use performance to make sense of the mix between human and technical life? I put that in question. Put that in quotes, what life means. There's a huge discussion if you go across over to Copenhagen at 4S on this issue about life. In fact, there's panels after panels about what life means. And this movement in so-called, that's arising now, and it has various names, from speculative ontology or speculative realism to new materialism to agent-oriented ontology, to you name it. But there's a kind of shift going on in the humanities and the social sciences toward trying to understand the position of things or objects in the world. That's a long-running discussion in the so-called studies of social science and technology that started already in the 1970s with the work of Bruno Latour. But now suddenly philosophers and cultural theorists have got into the fray. When I use the word performance, I have a very specific definition, and that is, as Eric said, the focus on dynamic temporal processes over static objects or representations. When we talk about this, that comes out of the work in a second. This is the book that Susan was mentioning, called Entangled. If people are interested, it's a big 500-page thing. I don't know why I wrote this huge thing. It tries to well, I mean, Susan will understand this, obviously, knows this quite well. Working in the kind of falling into the so-called new media world in the 1990s, kind of surprised that people were trying to reinvent the wheel all the time, and talking about things like participation, interaction, and I found this weird, again, coming from a performing arts background where those are just given, you know. So I wanted to see, you know, how it was that different practices that called themselves performative over, say, from industrial modernism to the current kind of computational age, how they transpired and how different disciplines like architecture, which is never thought about as performative, or of course theater, dance, the visual arts, sound, the media arts, and so on, all were engaging in this idea of performative practice. And secondly, to understand that technology, not technology as we understand it as a device or something we plug in a wall, which everyone thinks is what technology is, but technology as actually an ordering system, a way of establishing order on the world, because techne and logos, basically, the etymology in Greek is kind of establishing of techne, which is art or making or skill or knowing, and logos, which is of course the word, but logos also has to do with systems of order. So how it was that artists and researchers and designers have always been, and this word entangled has come up, I counted it this morning in 3 sessions, 26 times, how it is that we have always been entangled with the socio-technical systems around us, right? And how artists have been very long ago interested in how technologies shape and transform performative acts. So that's the book, but the book is actually, it's not a theoretical book. It tries to outline a history of from early industrial modernism, end of the 1800s, up until recently, how different practices have understood performance across those different fields. Okay, so that's what I mean by performance. So we have 3 kind of things we do. We may make works that tour around the world. We make enabling technologies, and then we publish things that are critical studies about those things. So I have PhD students that come from anthropology, sociology, engineering, food studies, art, design, architecture, computer music. I'm forgetting. So you can imagine this is like trying to corral cats or something. And they're all very interested in cutting across both disciplinary practices, but also trying to understand how their own work can benefit from this kind of cross-cultural and cross-epistemic dialogue. Okay, so enough theory. Let's talk about art, our experiences. So Displace. So Displace is a project funded by the Fondation Québec Recherche Sociale Culturelle, which is the social science money in Quebec. And it's a collaboration with David Howes, who's a cultural anthropologist at Concordia, who's very well known for his work on the so-called anthropology of the senses, as well as an independent artist, Tez, based in Amsterdam. And here is the question, the research question: can new kinds of media environments be used as an instrument for new forms of anthropological inquiry, particularly in relationship to sensory anthropology? And I'll talk about sensory anthropology. Sensory anthropology deals very much with the way in which different understanding of the senses operate in different cultures, socially and culturally, as opposed to just strictly from a neuroscientific point of view. And what are we trying to do in this project is to understand how could we build environments that invoke all of the senses simultaneously and use those as kind of, as David Howes says, as kind of training chambers or flight simulators, is his word, for anthropologists. So when they go out into the field, they might become more sensorially acute or aware. This is the definition of sensory anthropology. So sensory anthropology is quite interesting because it's actually derived from people like Marshall McLuhan and Edmund Carpenter in Canada. And Howes defines it as it's dedicated to charting the varieties of sensory experience through in-depth investigation of the distinct ways in which the senses are socialized in different cultural settings. Every culture has its own code for distinguishing and combining the senses. These ways of sensing give shape to the normative patterns of experience in that culture. What this means is that, as we say, each culture privileges a different mode of sensing. Now, of course, part of the aim of sensory anthropology is to debunk the idea that we exist in an ocular culture, which, of course, from art history to cultural studies has been the predominant framework for a long time of sensory experience, is the eye. In other cultures, for instance, the eye is not predominant. The nose may be predominant, or the body in different sensing modalities may be predominant. This is the book that Howes wrote, edited. I mean, he's written many books, but he edited a series from Berg called the Sensory Culture series. There's very interesting works in that series, but this is The Empire of the Senses, which is kind of the defining book, the sensual culture. So we have 5 senses, right? According to Aristotle, we have sight, we have hearing, we have touch, we have smell, and we have taste. And the reason those 5 senses arose originally was not because of the 5 sense organs, which of course were the hand, the nose, the mouth, the tongue, and the eye, but because they actually matched the four elements. So air, water, fire, and earth. For Aristotle, touch and taste are combined. But as I said, cross-modal sensing is very interesting. So it's only recently in the last, say, 15, 20 years that neuroscience has discovered and taken seriously that actually the senses don't operate as independent regions of the brain. Like you don't have just the auditory cortex or the visual cortex. That there's actually crosstalk going on between different neurons. And in fact, Charles Spence, who's in the UK, did a lot of work in so-called multisensory neurons, in fact, different neurons that actually deal with more than one sense, right? So this is a long debate that's gone on about where different sensory modalities take place in the brain. So, you know, let's take an example like smell. Smell and taste are intimately related to each other. If you lose your sense of smell, you also start to lose your sense of taste. And this has been confirmed by people who actually do lose their sense of smell, and vice versa. There's an amazing account of Grant Achatz. So Grant Achatz is a chef who runs a restaurant called Alinea in Chicago, and he's part of the kind of, he trained also with Ferran Adria. People know Noma across the water, the most expensive and most difficult restaurant to get into in the world. Achatz trained with Ferran Adria as well as the chef at Noma. And when Achatz opened his restaurant in Alinea in Chicago about 8 years ago, he had a very unfortunate experience. He developed tongue cancer. And this was 2 months before the restaurant was opening that he was diagnosed. He had to work with a chef, another chef, who would taste and he would smell simultaneously to try to understand what they were actually cooking. You know, so it's a very, once you lose one sense, other senses start to take over. So the very strange things start to happen. There's these things called sensory substitution, where one sense substitutes for another, and so on. So sound and touch, of course, are intimately related. Sound is actually the only sense that, depending on where its physical register happens, can become either operating at the ear, and once we drop below, well, normal adults, it's 20 hertz, but most of us can't hear 20 hertz. We can hear around 30 to 28 hertz. Once you drop below 20 hertz, you go into infrasound, and sound is not heard, it's only felt in the body, right, because it's vibration. So it's really interesting where you are in the frequency spectrum determines what sense sound is. Is it sound when it becomes vibration? Well, there's still waves going on, but in fact, the body sensorially responds to sound in a very different way than when it hears. So these are really interesting questions that come up about what happens when the senses mix. And as I said, the anthropology of the senses is trying to explode this idea that we only have 5 senses, and then the most important sense is the eye. This is a quote from Stephen Feld, well-known ethnomusicologist and ethnographer, University of New Mexico. As place is sense, senses are place. As places make sense, senses make place. He did a lot of work with the Kalui in New Guinea, and in which this particular tribe can't see very well because they're moving and through the jungle all the time, or the rainforest, and it's dark. So their sense of smell and their sense of hearing is much more predominant, and it's been recorded and studied by Feld in this way. Of course, there's this idea of sense ratios from McLuhan, and in fact, more recently, there's all these discussions about we don't have 5 senses, we have 21 senses. So, for instance, we have sight, which are 2 senses in a way because you have color and you have intensity of color, taste, touch, itching. That's a very interesting idea. We never thought about itching as a sense. We say, well, is that tactile? Well, yeah, itching's tactile, but it has also to do with pressure and pain, which also are not really within those 5 categories. Thermoception, which is your ability to distinguish something that is hot versus cold. Sound, as I said, sound, once it becomes under 20 hertz, it goes into vibration. Smell, proprioception, which is your understanding of your body in space, its position, its 3D position in space. Tension, nociception, which is, of course, pain. And there's different types of pain. There's cutaneous pain, which is at the surface. There's somatic pain, which is in the body. And then there's visceral pain, which is inside the viscera. The sense of balance in relationship to changes of direction, kinesthesis, which is bodily movement, stretch, the sense of your lungs expanding or contracting your stomach, that's also a sense. Chemoreceptors like drugs, thirst is a sense, hunger, and this is what I like very much, magnetoception, your sense of magnetic fields, which is in humans not very strong. And finally, the sense of time. Now, that's just a really interesting thing. Let's do an experiment. This is always a fun thing. Look at your watch and count 30 seconds. Now, go. Don't count. I mean, just watch the second hand, if you have a second hand. Okay, so that's about 30 seconds. Okay, now, don't look at your watch and count 30 seconds. Go. Stop. Which is longer? So exactly your question, like which sense longer? So which feels longer to you? Looking at the watch or counting? Well, then you're out of luck. So, what about someone who had a watch? 27. Okay. So, clock time feels longer to a lot of people. Yeah. So, so it's interesting. It's like, where do you place that between clock time and so-called kind of live time? Where do you place that? Is that a sense? Well, some people argue it is. And that's really interesting in terms of thinking about the way you shape spaces. Okay, so I'm just going to show you how this project arose, this project called Mediations of Sensation or Displays. We had different phases. So the first phase was David Howells ran a sensory anthropology seminar for the MA and PhD researchers involved in the project. We had anthropologists, we had people in design, as well as Tez, who's a professional artist, not in the university. And that ran for 6 months. And the goals were several things. One is we wanted to survey the literature in the field of sensory anthropology. So this is, of course, what you do as a researcher, right? You look at the literature and see what people have written about it. Second, we wanted to look at, in that literature, and we were looking at literature about work in Stephen Feld's work about the tea ceremony in Japan, work on the Anji and the Desana. Desana is in northern Colombia, about how they deal with color under the influence of psychoactive drugs. A very varying range of things is how art and anthropology are intersecting more and more, so etc. So what we were trying to do is identify where you would have these kinds of crossings between senses. Like, okay, this is talking about smell, this is talking about taste. Where are things starting to merge or mix together? And also, as artists, now I put the artist hat on, we were trying to understand how can you go from a written account, which is done by an anthropologist, outside of the field. You go to the field as an anthropologist, you experience, you're doing field work, you're observing, then you go out of the field and you write about what you've observed, right? And you're trying to, as accurately as possible, depict the culture that you have observed. The problem is that those accounts are all literary accounts, right? They're either symbolic, since we're trying to understand, there's a long strain in anthropology about symbolic anthropology, trying to understand the way symbols function in culture. But we were trying to understand, well, how do you translate that into material encounters? You know, if you're going to build something that people are going to enter into, inspired or informed by these accounts, how do you actually do that? Because these anthropological, ethnographic studies are mainly symbolic and literal in that sense. And we were looking for specific images, motifs, patterns from those text-based accounts. There's some of the texts we read. Then, at the same time, we started to do material research. And David Howe's, one of the cultures he's looked at is the Tzotzil, which is Mayan culture in Chiapas, who deal predominantly with the world from a thermo point of view, i.e. heat is the central element in their cosmology. Now again, these are highly symbolic accounts. So for instance, food has certain kinds of colors in their cosmology which are attached to how cold or hot something is. The sun is, of course, a critical element of that those are symbolic accounts, etc. So we were trying to think about how it would be with something like heat and vision and color would intersect. And we started to do material research with different kinds of techniques. So we work with thermochromics and photochromics, which are, of course, inks that change their color based on heat or based on light. We were looking at things like haze. We were trying to deal with something like taste, and so on. And what we produced in the beginning of this project was a gallery exhibition called Atmosphere, which was a public prototype for this much larger displays project. This is just some test images of what we were working on. We were trying to actually make surfaces out of fog that would appear and disappear. These are LEDs, very highly controlled LEDs, that as you change their color temperature and you change the degree of haze in the environment would give you the impression of actually something which looked like a screen but actually was not there. This is, one second here. Here's a test of a line which is appearing and disappearing on a wall. No, not yet. Now, this looks like an animation, but it's not. It's actually, yeah, it's me too. It's actually a wall, a white wall, which is then treated in thermochromic paint, and then a number of sensors on the other side of the wall, and actuators are delivering heat to 18 segments of the wall and making the black paint transparent, which exposes the line behind it. So in this environment, you had this very strange animated structure going, but people never knew it was actually, if something was there or not. They thought it was their eyes playing tricks on them. These are infrared heaters that produced quite intense heat in the gallery. And these are some images from it. So this was really material research that we put in front of the public to see what kind of response. We didn't do any kind of ethnographic work. We didn't interview people about their experience yet, but we were just trying to test out certain material ideas. Then we went further and we started to use the hexagram infrastructure to develop a large-scale installation performance. This is just shots. These are, for instance, drawings that have been made by members of the Dasana, this group of Indians in northern Colombia, after 6 hours of intense experience with yahe or ayahuasca, which is of course a mind-altering psychoactive drug, and they would draw in the sand these kinds of pictures. These are very similar to the kinds of pictures that people drew in the 1960s when they were subjected to flicker experiments, i.e. flashing light at certain frequencies in the eye, and then your eye produces what are called phosphenes, i.e. they're essentially images produced by the brain. And you can just see now the scale grows. We took one of the one of the main symbolic elements of this Dasana culture, which was the hexagon, and actually built a huge environment, again using those principles of light and fog. This is now research into the taste systems done by David Santo, who's a PhD student in gastronomy, and actually he's in an interdisciplinary PhD program at Concordia, but he's working in food studies. And he's very well aware of the way taste systems culturally and physiologically operate. So he started to design taste structures for this environment that we were building. This is bitter honey from Italy. This is some experiments with different kinds of gels and liquids. It looks like a science lab, of course. These are a combination of gels made of onion juice, blueberry juice, and konbu with agar-agar. Again, more research. And then last November, the American Anthropological Association had its annual conference in Montreal. And we put this work, this displaced environment, into the peer-reviewed program of that conference. And that was very interesting because they have a thing called InEvents, which is anthropology pushed to the edge. And while it was not at the Congress Center where the conference took place, it was part of the program. And so we had hundreds of anthropologists coming from the conference to Hexagram to experience this environment. So it was a prototype. We had 6 people at a time over the span of 45 minutes that were moved through a series of environments. And then actually afterwards, with anthropologists on our team, we did group interviews with those participants. And then there was a panel at the AAA about this whole project, and then there was a lot of outreach, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of how we've used the hexagram infrastructure to do something which reaches these different kinds of audiences. Because it wasn't an art gallery, it wasn't a theater, people didn't know where they were going. They arrived at this very strange research space and they had this experience. So this is building that project. We created this tunnel in which the room was completely dark. There were 5 different spaces within this large black box that we sent people through. These are some of the gels that were developed. This was the first environment. People came in, they sat down, they were anointed with menthol or camphor tiger balm. Their heads started to burn, then they were served drinks, and they were separated. They were sent down that long tunnel in total darkness. These are some pictures from that. And then they sat atop the platform. They came back together as a group. And then over 10 minutes, they experienced this, sitting on that platform, this very intense light and sound display. And then they were led out through these huge columns, which were scented into the interview space. To show you a little bit. Now I need sound. Let me just stop this for a second. Hold on a second. Okay. Now I get to plug the cable in here. Are you still with me? Okay. So this is just some very quick footage of that project. So after their brains have been rattled, then they are progressed through this weird kind of forest of trees, and it's very calming, and because they're trying now to orient their bodies back in space, because of this very quite assaultive experience that happened, that precedes it. And then this is the idea of the dissemination of the so-called knowledge which is created in the projects. We have 12 hours of interviews, which we're still going through. There are book chapters coming out. So this book, Alien Agency, one of the studies in that book is this project looking at how the senses as material kinds of agents function. There's articles coming out. One of the graduate students is in anthropology, but also is training as a documentary filmmaker, is intervening, part of her dissertation work is intervening in a particular site of the disappeared in Argentina where she's from. So she's using some heuristics we developed, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it was this kind of prototype for that particular conference. We had a very, very interesting audience because it was a very unusual and informed audience. And it was mixed. It wasn't just the anthropologists, it was also people from the general public. Then, in this past September, we completely redid the project for a huge festival in The Hague called Today's Art. And here you have a very, very different context, because this is not an anthropology festival. This is a big art festival, mainly focused on new types of performing and visual arts. We had a whole building. We redesigned the project based on the ethnographic data that we gathered. It's a different cultural, obviously spatial context. One of the comments that many of the groups gave us originally was that we orchestrated people moving through these environments in Montreal. So it was very, very controlled. Part of that was for security reasons because they were in a very dark room. But also part of it was like sequencing experience. Like you experience this, then you're separated, then you're brought back together. And so there was a very big emphasis on kind of the social relations and the manipulation of those relations. Many people commented that they didn't feel like their senses could open up because they were so constrained by this kind of control system. So we completely abandoned that. And we, in The Hague, we created a much more flow-through environment that people could spend as much time as they wanted in these different rooms. And it was much more like, you know, going through a kind of park as opposed to this kind of highly controlled flow. And because of that, the emphasis in The Hague was much more about the sensory affects that happen to you versus the kind of social configurations that occur when trying to deal with this sensory onslaught. Yeah. In September. Yep, it just happened. Yeah. If you go on Design Boom, there was a big thing about it. Just quickly, and I realize I'm running really out of time. I'm gone way over as always, and I'll just show you the video for Polytope because it's already way too much. But this is the downstairs environment. This was a room that actually was in complete darkness, covered with 2 tons of rock salt on the floor. When you came, you put on surgical booties, and you walked into a totally dark room. You were given a crystal. The crystal was salt covered in sugar. You were told to put this into your mouth once you entered the room, not before. Once you entered into this space, you see these 2 objects at the top in the ceiling. Those are 2 3,000-watt strobe lights. And no one ever saw this room as something that was let's say, a real-time image for the eye. The only way you saw the room was an after image. The reason is because these strobes were slightly timed off each other and would flash for approximately 30 milliseconds. Now, you know, 30 milliseconds is 30/1000th of a second. Close to the blink of an eye when she just blinked. So imagine a burst of light that's so strong that it whites out the room, and as your eye recovers in the darkness afterwards, you see the after image of the room. But you never see the real room. You only see your optical after image of it. So you encounter, as you walk, this salt under your feet, in your mouth. The room smells of salt, but at the same time, you're also, you know, encountering this optical change. And that object on the wall is a parabolic reflector. If anyone knows anything about parabolic sound, if you project sound into a parabolic reflector, you get a straight beam. So sound basically diffuses into a line and creates the illusion that there's another speaker across the room. So if I had a parabolic reflector here, I could aim the sound at that wall, and if you walk by that wall, you would only hear the sound at that point on the wall in which that reflection was taking place, and then it would go to the next wall, and so on. So it's a very strange experience because it feels like someone's coming up to you and speaking in your ear, or you hear something right at your ear level and not diffused in the room. What was going on in this room was that we were separating the sensory modalities. We dealt with taste, touch, vibration, vision, but they were all carefully cut apart from each other. So there was no fusion going on. When you came into the next room, you walked through a series of curtains, and the room was saturated in smell. It's the smell of a medieval scent, which was sweet. And you lay under this screen, which was saturated in color-changing LED light. And there are at times 30 people lying on this. This was a mattress of memory foam, so as you lie on it, it contours to your body. And this was accompanied by binaural sound, which of course there's a lot of studies of the way binaural beats create certain relationships to color in the brain. Here's just a little bit of how... It's just test footage. And then you went upstairs to the third space, and then once again you encountered this hexagon. This room was very different, though, because of its... This environment was continuing over an hour kind of time curve. So people would kind of come in at different levels of intensity. Sometimes the environment was very quiet. They would lie on this hexagon and just kind of drift. Other times it would be very, very, very intense in terms of the sensory overload that's happening from the optical and the auditory perspective. There was also scent changing in this room, and people claim they smell different things, different colors, temperatures, and so on. And then we designed the most invasive element. Again, David Santo was working with us, who designed the food structures for the first version. And he designed liquids and gels. These gels were made of salt water and extracted from peppermint trees. And this is a weird thing called sponge toffee from Quebec, which is a weird kind of sponge sugar that when you put in your mouth, it gets stuck in your teeth. But it also dissolves. And he flavored that with varying degrees of chilies that had varying degrees of intensities on the scale, the hot scale of chilies. So people were eating these, and this was the most visceral reaction people had, which is literally spitting these things out, throwing up. And I'm not making a joke of this. It's interesting that you can, and David brought this point up. He said, taste is the most invasive sense we have because you put something in your mouth, and even if you spit it out, you have the lingering aftertaste. Whereas sound, yes, you can kind of close your ears. It's hard, but because you still feel vibration. But vision, you can of course close your eyes. So this penetration of the body is very interesting when you start to explore it in relationship to these other senses. And I want to make it very clear that this project, some of the research questions are about where these modalities come together and where they separate, and not just this is about smell or this is about taste, like taste-based art or smell art, but really how do these senses interweave with each other? So what is the intersensorial experience? And then once again, we had another anthropologist working with us who observed people in the environment and then did hours of interviews with them afterwards on the street, trying again to capture what the lived experience of this environment was like. And so we have a lot of data, and there was a very clear protocol of questions, and this is not just random. It was all highly designed to kind of gather some kinds of sensory experiences of what it means to be directly affected by this. Okay, I think that's enough, because I wanted to show the Polytope project. Maybe what I'll just do is show you 5-minute video, and then we can go into questions. Because I know it's already. This is a totally different project, and it addresses. I mean, it's also interested in the body's relationship to a technical milieu or technological environment, but it's very, very different. This was done in Spain in Gijón at the Laboral Center for Art and Industrial Creation, which is in the northern part of Spain, this past summer. And it's a reimagining of the composer Iannis Xenakis' Polytope projects from the 1960s, which were large-scale environments of light and sound, and which Xenakis was trying to grapple with the way in which you could temporalize space in a way. And it uses reinforcement learning algorithms. This is just a lot of stuff. But I'll just show you the video. That's the space that we're in. It's a huge 60-meter room. This is a center that has about 160,000 square meters. It's absolutely enormous. And so we designed this project for this room. This project is part of a project with some of these industrial partners called Emerge, which is to look at how we can design emergent media systems. And what I mean by that is how we can use certain ideas coming from cybernetics in the 1950s and current research in so-called like weak AI or machine learning techniques to drive an environment. People know what a show control is. A show control is a device, usually timeline based, that controls every kind of media environment you experience, from Disneyland to the trains here in Malmo. So some machine is telling the video on the walls in the train station here to turn on and turn off. Something is switching on the fog machine, something is turning on the video or doing mapping, or these are the predominant devices that are used in location-based entertainment. Show control has a problem. Most of the models we have are timeline-based. This is a question that, of course, comes up in interaction design all the time, whether it's a timeline or whether it's some more network. Or the problem is that show controls have no intelligence. They don't know how to take input data from the environment and do something with it. I mean, they can take input data, they can take sensor data, for instance. You can hook up a switch to it, for instance, or or some kind of passive infrared detector that looks at movement, and then you can use that to say, okay, at this point in the show, if there's a lot of movement over in that corner, turn this projector on or off. This is standard industry stuff. The problem with these devices is they have no intelligence, i.e., we have no way of creating systems that could produce interesting behaviors in the media, like in light or in sound or in video, without having to pre-script everything. Okay, this is a long discussion in interaction design and computer science about the difference between scripted rules versus systems which emerge, in which the behaviors emerge over time. So this project, in the spirit of Xenakis, who was interested in using statistical techniques or so-called stochastic processes in music in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s to generate much more complex musical environments in which the composer would determine the rules, or let's say the parameters of the composition, but then would use statistical processes to see how that composition would evolve. This is to go the next step and see how can we use sensing systems and software to enable an environment to dynamically adapt to its surroundings. So this is the video. Goes fast, but give you some sense. These are original pictures from the first polytope that Xenakis did in Montreal in '67. This is in France in 1972. This is the installation of the architectural structure that is a central element. Xenakis was also trained as a structural engineer, so he was working in architecture. He worked for Le Corbusier, in fact. These are all the electronics that are built onto these steel cables. You can see the scale of this project.
So we can talk more about this project because it went quickly through it. But what you're essentially seeing is an environment being controlled by software agents in the computer that then actuate light and sound in the actual space and try to adapt the way that light and sound works over time based on what the environment from sensing is telling those agents. And so you have a composition. It ran, for instance, as a performance, 15 minutes, 5 times a day. You have a performance which is quite dynamic in the sense that its behavior is different each performance to a certain degree, and in which these algorithmic processes orchestrate different kinds of behaviors over time, and consequently have a very different experience for the audience. So, but we can talk more about that in the next 20 minutes. Okay, thanks.
Right. So, I mean, a few questions come to mind, but I really want to hear. We'd like to hear from the audience. So, if anybody has an initial question they want to throw out there right now, I thought I would first ask you all. Yeah. Please speak. Everyone, please speak into the mic when you ask questions. And if someone else wants to do a follow-up question, just pass the mic around amongst you. Thank you.
It's about the senses.
Yeah.
Since you seem to, well, you as a group have designed installations around this concept of sense and how they combine. Have you also looked into how they differ depending on their age, so the senses themselves? Because, for example, smell is the oldest and therefore most closely linked to our primitive brain, so to speak, and
To the limbic system.
and the limbic system, those kind of things, and because of that, maybe also more visceral when you have this.
Yeah, that's
close
an
to
interesting.
basic
That's
stuff.
a very interesting question. I'll put it this way: part of the audience in The Hague, for instance, in terms of the age of people, in terms of what kind of sensory acuity they might have, was very wide-ranging. So we had kids that were 17 and 16 and 15, like teenagers actually, and then we had people up to in their 70s, and one of the arguments which is made is that when you're born and in the first stages of life, we actually don't have the sensory separation. So a lot of research in synesthesia has said that we actually are more synesthetic because we don't have language and we don't have these ways of describing objects like this is sense, this is sight, this is sound. So the world is a kind of blurry, interconnected thing. And then, of course, language kicks in, learning kicks in, and the cognition takes over. And so then we start to make a clear separation. Then, toward the end of life, the human life, the senses once again return back to that blurred state because of age, right? So disorientation cuts in, which is why, for instance, oddly enough, most retirement or aging homes are very anti-sensorial. And there's a lot of research now being done to change that because they realize that people lose their sense of smell, their sense of taste, their sense of touch as not just medically, but as you get older. And so what we should be doing is heightening those senses. And in fact, Chrétien van Kampen came to this project. He's a very interesting researcher who wrote this book, The Hidden Sense, that MIT published, about synesthesia. But he works in social policy in the Netherlands and is trying to understand the question about the aging of a population, its relationship to these sensory experiences. And he came through and he gave this story where he said he felt that this project went from kind of birth to death, in the sense that as you get older, this last environment is completely disorienting because the senses are all blurred together. Whereas if you're in that kind of color room, things are fused, but you can still make the difference between this color, this is light, this is smell. These things start to have different registers, but as you go to that last room, things. So we haven't done this extensive research on that question, but it is a very interesting one because the kids that went through I just listened to some of the interviews very quickly because it's so much I haven't had time to listen to it. But the kids that went through would stay for an hour. I mean, we're totally kind of zoning out. And some people who were in their mid-age went through very quickly to get in. Okay, this room, and out. And then we had older people, and they also stayed longer. So it was very interesting, this
this thing that Chrétien said about this kind of beginning, early age versus late age, and then this middle, thing that occurred.
That's a very interesting answer. Thanks for that. But I meant age in the sense of...
Yeah, I know. You meant age in terms of like where the brain responds in terms of more primitive senses. So of course, touch, taste, and smell have always been called the lower senses because of this very thing, because they somehow operate at the limbic system level. Yeah. And this is disputed, but they were never taken seriously, of course, in neuroscience, but also in cultural, studies of cultural history, for instance. It's hard to tell, because if you play with sensory, the registers of sensory intensity and the ranges of that, those kind of ideas about, well, this kind of sense is more primitive than this other sense start to break down, because you're amping up the...
I didn't want to term it that smell is more primitive in that sense, but for example, it's also shown that if you lose sense of smell, you tend to be emotionally more flat, because there's a close connection to those kind of things.
Right. Or there's a famous story from Oliver Sacks, about a painter who gets into a car accident and he loses his sense of color. And actually, because of losing the sense of color, he starts to describe taste as bland and smell as bland. Like smell becomes monochrome, which is a really weird idea, that smell becomes monochrome, So it's clear that that sensory loss results in the transformation of other sensory modalities.
And a much shorter follow-up question, then someone else can
answer.
Sure. Have you also thought about artificial senses? Because I've heard of experiments where they gave people a belt which made them always feel where magnetic north is, and that actually your brain makes that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. But you can also create really artificial senses without, let's say, certain kinds of augmented devices by walking across a surface that has different thicknesses of material. Like if you walk across a floor and the layer of sand you're walking on is this thin and then it gets thicker, you have you get a different sense of movement, for instance, or weight. So there's been a lot of research, in artificial noses, and also, trying to give people devices to kind of disorient them. But you can also do it with things like light and sound, the shape of a room. In fact, when people came up the stairs to this third environment, we actually put a whole curtain wall. So they just had to. They came out of this color space and they came into blackness, and they had to reorient their body and try to figure out where they were, and they had to then walk down this corridor, which stretched the width of that room, and then they came around, and then they realized there's another room there, So even the slight shift of proprioceptively, how do you orient your body by architecture, also augments and changes that sensory perception. So.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, good question.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much. Two questions. One's really quick, and the second one can be quick too. I'm curious about why you don't refer to synesthesia and call it cross-modal. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah. Because cross-modal isn't synesthetic. Cross-modal doesn't substitute one sense for the other. So this kind of crossing over that happens in synesthesia. So the most common form of synesthesia is color grapheme synesthesia, i.e. you see in letters color. And in fact, there's a test that Ramachandran, neuroscientist, developed where you can look at, you'll know immediately if you're synesthetic. And synesthesia is a very rare neurophysiological phenomena. There are very few people who are synesthetes in terms of the overall population. There's been, of course, in the history of art, very much interest in synesthesia, but from Scriabin to Ligeti to you name it. But the problem is that's usually used as a metaphor. Well, I want scent and color to mix, But synesthesia, you know, from a medical point of view, is a specific neurological disorder. And that's why I don't, whereas cross-modal perception is not a disorder, it's actually just what's happening in the brain all the time. And cross-modal is exchange or crosstalk, whereas synesthesia is where these things fuse. So that's why I make the separation.
And the second question relates to senses, I'm going to say, versus affect.
Yeah.
I've seen your work over the years, and there can be this incredible, overwhelming sensory barrage. And talking about it in terms of senses or sensory overload or sensory transformation or cross-modal sensing is one thing. But I'm wondering if there's a point when what's happening from a sensory perspective is actually diverging from what's happening affectively, or whether they kind of will float in and out with one another. Because the common assumption is that affect roughly, you know, it's close to emotions, it's close to senses, it might somehow be tied to it. But I'm wondering if your work will actually pull them apart or create a collision or... I'll stop there. I'll let you say more.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, and that's what I'm trying to figure out how to write about. Okay, so you know, there's lots of understandings as we know of affect. If we go back to Sylvan Tompkins, who kind of in psychology is the kind of inventor of that term, affect, it usually refers to this question of emotion, right? But then there's this definition or kind of concept of affect that's come about in cultural studies, which is about a kind of pre-linguistic sense. Notion of sensation, right? That it operates on the body before one has the ability to articulate what's actually happening, you know. It's interesting because we're very aware of the instruments we're using. They're like technologies of the senses. I mean, you know, Foucault has this idea of the 4 types of technologies, and technology of the self is one of them. We're talking about kind of technology of the senses, in which these certain devices actually do produce certain kinds of physiological effects, which then may result in this kind of affective shift. And I think part of the question of affect is related to the scale of intensity. So if you go from you know, this other project I've done called Just Noticeable Difference actually deals with, we put one person inside a room, into a box, lying on a floor of vibrotactile actuators in total darkness, and we start to work with sound, and then that shifts into vibration. It's all underneath the body. In that sense, the sensory intensity register is down to the JND, the ability to detect the slightest difference between the intensity of one sensory stimuli and the next in time. As it amps up, as it shifts the range of intensity, as it gets more intense, in the sense that there's more external stimulation, then the question of affect seems to take over, because affect is usually associated with overload, as you pointed out. But it's interesting because this kind of quietness, or the lack of input, or the lack of the thresholding, you know, below the scale of perception, also tends to generate this kind of affective move. And so I mean, affect is, if we look at it from a psychophysics point of view, it's actually very much related to where you are on the scale of stimuli, not in relation to perception, but really like from that, you know, external point of view. But I think there's another thing about affect, is that we're very aware of how these machines work. Like, we've used those strobes now for 7 years. So we know exactly their color temperature, how fast they trigger. And so we can, you know, like a great sculptor shapes clay or bronze, you think, well, this is an electronic instrument. You know, how much range does it have? Well, it actually has a lot. So we're very aware of how it works. And where is the border in using that instrument where we actually do produce some response, and the response moves into this kind of affective response, meaning you don't know, you can't articulate what is going on in the moment in which it takes place. And it's very interesting as why we do these interviews afterwards, because then the experience is past. You know, but it's immediately afterwards. It's not 2 days later in a focus group. It's really after that very intense, and I mean, again, across the range of senses, experience, and then people try to articulate what is going on now in my body and what's just happened. And we try to ask people to trace back, where were they, what was going on at a particular moment, did things blur, were they separated, you know, all of these kinds of questions. So the affective question seems to be central to the discussion about the senses versus it falling back into symbols or representations, or on the other extreme, you know, neurophysiological triggers. You know. Yeah.
Just take the microphone, please.
Just, on the same subject, what about the fact that our perception of sense is always relative to our previous input?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Totally. And it's also it's previous input in the sense of just what's just happened.
Yeah.
And also, you know, and that's interesting too, because these projects are so much using temporal structures, you know, orchestrating the senses in time, you know, and then trying to mix the senses being orchestrated in time. So we ask a very specific question. What is the time constant of each of those senses? So the time constant of a flash of light versus a continuous tone versus smell, which is ambient, which has a long time constant, you know. How all of those time constants are interrelating with each other. So the question of where we are in time is really critical in these environments, because if you walk in and then you walk out, it's very different than if you're there, you know, and you experience what's just happened and what's happened before that and what's happened before that. And it's very different than the theater, where you sit down in your chair and you are there for 2 hours and you watch a narrative unfold. Here you have to make your own narrative, because you may be entering into a different place in time, you know, in where the system is. So yes, it's again highly contingent, based on where you are in time, you know, your own bodily time, and also the time of the experience that's been pre-constructed, and at the same time that you enter into. So.
I thought I would just go back to the first half of your presentation, when you presented as a two-part thing.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is twofold. First of all, this department, Medea, and the K3, we're about to move into a new building in 2 years. It's a process we have debatable levels of say in, but just in regards, I thought maybe it would be interesting to hear, as we're going through this, to hear how your experience was of setting up this new lab, and maybe the situated aspects of it, parts in terms of the buildings or the
Sure.
labs themselves, what has worked well, even things that you might warn us of,
Okay.
and so on. And the second part of my question is thinking about the two-part structure of your presentation. If you want to, if there's any kind of reflexive ways you can think about your own work, or the work of that you've been showing us, the kind of, where does the infrastructure stop and where does the art begin, and is there kind of crossover and so on?
Okay, yeah, great questions. First of all, Hexagram was designed before I got there, so I had no say in how it was designed. But having a lot of experience in designing labs and thinking about infrastructures, I can say where the problems are. You know, this is called consulting, right? You know, this has been the kind of assumption in digital media for a long time, that all you just need is a room with some computers and then you can make something. You know, this is total nonsense. Now, the kinds of projects I do are coming from a performance model. So they need infrastructure. And I mean infrastructure in the sense of not just, they need space, but they also need the apparatuses, the machinery of performance. And I was always struck, I'm sure Susan also has the same experience, working in the media arts, where, you know, they don't rehearse. i.e. you walk into a gallery situation and they have to reinvent the wheel every single time, you know, versus I walk into the this is the white box, black box model, right? I walk into the room and it's black. There's a grid that's, or winches that are mechanically controlled that go up and down. I can hang big heavy things on them. I can fly people in the air. The speakers are not fixed to the wall. The seats aren't fixed to the floor. You know, there are Ethernet ports and what have you in every part of the wall. There's outlets in the floor and on the wall. I mean, all of these things, because people always talk about, we want to make this flexible environment where things move around and all this, and then they design rooms that don't make that possible, you know. And Hexagram was designed that same way. That black box, for instance, was designed in such a cockamamie way that there was a booth. I'm looking at the booth here, this window up here, you know, where you put your lighting board and your sound board. And it was, the windows were so high that you could sit down and never look out the window to see what was going on below, you know. Or the speakers were designed by people from electroacoustic music who had the idea that you could have a surround studio of 8 speakers, and it would just sound great, and you could just do the same thing. You would take those speakers and make the duplicate set of those speakers and put them in this giant, you know, 10 by 14 meter black box. Well, that obviously doesn't work because the room's acoustics are totally different than a recording studio, you know. So if you're going to encourage projects that deal with the kind of scale of performative research, or take those models, and I think theater is actually a really important model for research, right? Because it understands, you go into a room, you transform that space. Space has to be flexible enough, but at the same time have enough infrastructure to enable what you're going to do, and then you leave it, and then it goes back to its kind of, well, it's never neutral, but its original state. So Hexagram, you know, didn't think a lot about how to do that. The other problem architecturally in this building is that you have labs behind closed doors. So there's no public site where people can meet. There's rooms where people can go in with a key, you know, and use the room, and then you can open the walls, but there's no public space. This is critical. If you want to have a research lab and you want people to interact, you have to have a place where they actually will meet, to have lunch, to talk, and most buildings are designed so there's a lot of rooms with a lot of closed doors, and people go behind those closed doors. Well, how do you expect them ever going to meet if they don't have any public space in which to meet? So it's a very good example of how architecture can construct and shape social relations in a research framework. The second question, Eric, about infrastructure is really interesting. It's very difficult. I mean, STS has 30 years to say about questions of infrastructure, but it's very difficult in the projects I showed you to say this is where the infrastructure ends and the art begins, because they're completely entangled with each other. Even the fact that, and this was interesting in The Hague, by having to make this work to rethink it with a completely different audience, a completely different architecture, completely different milieu, and to adapt it from a research framework, where people have to sign consent forms that are ethics-based approval, all of these kinds of things, and know that they're being recorded and blah, 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 and can opt out and all of this stuff. It's a very different animal, and this is the real difficulty about moving research from the university into the public sphere, because it's no longer research. It's research in a certain way because you're trying to see what knowledge is being made from that traditional understanding of research, but it's now in the wild, so to speak, and so it's harder to control. It's harder to control under the kinds of disciplinary structures that the university wants to implement. So, for instance, getting these kinds of projects through ethics committees is very interesting. They want you to know 3 years before what you're doing. It's like, well, I have no idea. I don't know how big the room is that we're going to do this in, and well, is there going to be a sign? Is it people going to know? All of these kinds of crazy things that in any kind of like sociology study would be evident from the start. But we're not sitting people down and interviewing them. like in a lab. It's a very different kind of situation. So infrastructure is intimately related to the social technical assemblage. That's the the 4S language for enabling the work and also actually being part of the work. You can see infrastructure, again, maybe this comes back from theater. Infrastructure not only enables, but it actually is integral to the experience. The ability to turn out the lights and make it completely dark. So when I designed my own little lab at Concordia, which is actually not in the building where Hexagram is, because there was no space acoustically that would be good enough to use, because the acoustics were stripped out of the building when the architects were finished, because it was too expensive. And someone looked on a balance sheet and said, "Oh, acoustics, we don't need that. We don't see that." So consequently, all the rooms give you headaches because they have no baffling, so all the high frequencies bounce around. So imagine sitting in a design studio teaching for 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hours a day, and everyone getting headaches because there's fluorescent lights and there's absolutely no acoustic treatment to buffet all of those high frequencies which are produced by people's voices. So when I designed my lab, it's a small room. It's a mini black box. It's completely dark. My wife always like, "Oh my God, this is like a pit, in the beautiful Montreal summer. It's in this dark room with no windows." But it was very specific because it was designed to make it so dark that projects that wanted to deal, for instance, with the just noticeable difference of perception could be possibly made. Whereas, try to do it in this room. I mean, this is a very nice room. It seems like a very interesting social space, but to make it dark, to control the conditions so that perceptual possibilities can take place would be impossible. So, it's a really interesting thing about how architecture conditions perceptual experiences, conditions, the way of approach of making things, and the way people design, there's lots of research in this, the way people design laboratories is very interesting because, my model of a laboratory is not the computer science lab where the grad students are sitting around at their computers in the lab all the time working. It's actually oriented around projects. So the production schedule builds up at a project level and people are all working in that black box or over there, and then it dissolves. And then it comes back again, So it has these different waves, which are very different than the kind of, we're working for the next 5 years on this, these algorithms, and we'll go present at this conference, and then we'll come back, and it's operating on a different mode of production in that way. I'm losing this thing.
I had a question about how the audience perceive the tales about the senses and about memory, because I thought about Marcel Proust's work À la recherche du temps perdu,
of course,
and the taste experiences of these biscuits and smell experiences. They are also taking you back in time to old memories that are very, very strong. And I wanted to ask you if during in these case studies or in other work, you have got such kind of public of audience reactions about memory.
Very strong ones. Here's one example. When some of the anthropologists, when it was shown at the AAA, were interviewed, their memories of fieldwork came into play. So they were projecting what they had experienced in the field, because that's their experience with kind of material, as academics, material confrontation, they were projecting what they experienced in the field into what they were experiencing in this room. So for instance, one person had done a lot of work in Tibet. She says, well, I'm sitting on this platform and I'm sitting on a cushion. She says, well, do this all the time in a monastery, and I did this for 2 years. And so I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, oh, that's what this is for me. This is this memory, because I'm sitting on this cushion, but at the same time I'm not in Tibet. I'm on this hexagon platform, and so it's this disjunction of memory. Smell, Caro Verbeek, who designed the smells along with another artist for the most recent displays, is very interested in that very question, of course, from Proust and on, that smell is incredibly strong memory evoker. You know, the interesting thing is that when smell, which, you know, I smell this and, oh, so David Santo, who designed the taste, who's very critical of this idea of smell and memory, he said, he would basically say, like, Carl would come and say, here, smell this, you know, it's the scent of the Middle Ages, you know, and blah, 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 blah. And he says, and he goes, oh, it's got lavender. And he goes, it smells like my grandmother's closet. Where Carl was like, you know, it invokes this da 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 da, you know, and he's like, yes, it smells like my grandmother's closet. So, you know, that is his memory. So you know, because smell is so individualized in that sense, you know, it's very difficult to get a kind of generalized notion of smell that could operate in a general way. And of course, the senses, there are no generalizations, but, you know, so like what one smells, and this is what I mean like invasive, what one smells, another has a very different reaction to that. So we try to use smell in let's say, not to bypass memory, because that's going to happen anyway, but somehow to invoke other senses. So, for instance, in that color room, David, the taste designer, he said he didn't want people to taste anything in the color room, but he wanted them to smell things that evoked taste. And because the two themes we were using were salt and sugar, from the taste perspective, he asked the smell designers to develop a salty smell, which is actually impossible because there's no salty smell, and a sweet smell. And that's where this whole debate came about, well, this is sweet, but it smells like this memory, you know, and so you always refer, there's a representation, you know, that it goes away from what Susan was asking about affect, where you bypass the representation, and memory can be a representation in some ways. Because you say, it smells like my grandmother's closet. It smells like my, you know, the first time I walked through a field of wildflowers, you know, as opposed to, what is this doing? And part of mixing the senses together is to confuse to make people fall back onto those kinds of, the sense is standing in for something else, which is, you know, as you say, very, very difficult because everyone's going to have this very individual, especially with smell, very individual experience. That's part of the challenge and that's where my memory, you know, because there's lots of work in cultural studies of smell, like Constance Classen, who wrote with David Howes, wrote this whole book on aroma, the cultural history. She's one of the world's experts in cultural history of smell and touch. And it's loaded with those questions about the way in which smell evokes memory, you know, cultural memory, for instance, you know. Yeah, so those things will inevitably come up, but at the same time we're kind of short-circuiting them to look at this more what bodily starts to happen.
And I'm going to have to short-circuit things
yes.
further because it's 6. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chris's work can be located in various spots in
Europe
and in North America, and the new book should be coming out, and the old book is already out, and I think that we'll be maintaining ties between Chris and Hexagram and Medea and K3. So
Definitely.
let's keep this space open.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.